Yo, what's up? I'm back at it, playing Dead Island once
Sick a
again.
lot during that time.
You're also listening to Milwaukee Cannibal, Jeffrey Dahmer, rare Jeffrey Dahmer documentary.
He was quite an enigma. He could make people laugh. But what made him different about that was that he always made himself the target of ridicule
Going green.
in doing that. He would always set himself up in these very bizarre situations.
So we made it to the
And
jungle.
often people laughed because they were so embarrassed, and embarrassed both for him and for themselves.
At the age of 12, 13, or 14, Jeff liked to tell jokes. He liked to act goofy, just like I did at that age. Now, when we get into 15, 16, that's where the marriage was starting to really deteriorate. Things were getting very serious. I could see a darkening of his mood. I attributed that to the divorce,
What's up?
the disruption, the shattering of his family. I was extremely occupied
Shocking
with
crowbar mod.
taking care of the home, the medical and psychological problems, and work. So it was really, I mean, not to rationalize, but it was really a very difficult time to emotionally stay in touch with my son, Jeff.
One of the strongest memories I have of Jeff was that it seemed to me that he was drunk a lot. And beginning at a very young age, I first remember it about 15 or 16, and especially at the age of 16 was when I noticed that he was actually drinking in the open in school, in the classroom. And both astonished me and the fact that nobody seemed to notice or care, I found quite amazing at the time.
It was on this Bath Road where we moved, and Jeff and I participated with a lot of activities and events. We planted all the evergreens on the property together, planted a garden together every year. But it was at this time where he roamed around these roads on his bicycle with garbage bags looking for animal remains, animals that had been hit by cars, such as dogs and raccoons, and took them back into the woods, unknown to any of us.
All right, bet.
And dissected them just to see what was on their inside. Jeff also had a what you'd call a pet cemetery.
Shut up.
It was a little area where he would put little crosses.
Shut up.
And remains of chipmunks and so forth. And it was across the street, up in the neighbor's woods. So it was about this time that things were starting to develop apparently in his mind, taking a bizarre turn.
What over here?
At the age of 18, just before his parents' divorce, he was left alone in the house. He picked up a hitchhiker, invited him home, and killed him. Remains of the body lay buried under the house for 12 years. This first crime and all those that followed, Jeffrey Dahmer eventually confessed to Detective Kennedy.
I think he did feel truly abandoned, and when he had the first individual or first victim with him, they were together drinking, and when this individual decided to leave, I think Jeff just wanted to stop him from leaving. I don't believe in my mind that he premeditated to murder this individual, but when he hit him with the barbell, it was done while he was intoxicated. Doesn't excuse it, but I don't believe there was any premeditation there.
I should have found decent interests to
Pretty beautiful, not gonna lie.
If I had done that, I wouldn't be here today. I'd be living pretty decently. But that night in Ohio, that's when everything went down the tubes, really. So nothing's really been normal ever since then.
Jeffrey Dahmer explained these thoughts and feelings in a recorded interview with the psychologist Dr. Kenneth Smale. Their conversations included Jeffrey Dahmer's childhood and adolescent years.
In Jeff's early adolescence, he had developed these thoughts and fantasy toward sexual urges of men, and also within that thinking also was urges to have sex with very passive and deceased people. He had planned or had fantasies of hurting other people. He gave an account of lying in wait for a jogger to go by, and he had a baseball bat, and the plan was to club the person at least unconscious, if not to kill him, and then to have some sort of sexual contact. On that day, the jogger didn't go by, so there was no consummated act. But he had those thoughts and urges before he actually killed his first victim.
Aw.
I sort of wrapped myself up in a fantasy world during the latter part of elementary school. Never was interested in what seems to me is 99% of the population of the world is, leading a family life, you know.
Jeffrey Dahmer graduated, but expressed no interest in his future.
I tried to instill a sense of direction into him, but it must have seemed terribly irrelevant to him to be talking to Jeff about that when he had recently committed a murder.
His father and stepmother
Nice.
saw the army as a possible solution.
In those days, we still believed the Army could make a man out of a boy. We didn't see Jeff then for the next 2.5 years. We corresponded with him. When Jeff did get out of the service, he came home. He had a wonderful work ethic. He was really trying, but he soon slipped back into the old pattern of drinking. Out of frustration, after many, many attempts of trying to dry him up, get him psychological care, help him out, we said to him, why don't you go to Grandma's, think life over, and decide, Jeff, what you want to do. We'll help you, we'll support you, but just please, please understand you can't continue living with us this way.
In January 1982, Jeffrey Dahmer left for his grandmother's house in Milwaukee. Lionel hoped that her influence might give him a sense of purpose and direction.
Because he loved his grandmother and the fact that she was this religious, devoutly religious woman who did impart some of her religious values on him, and he saw them as good, strong values, something to take hold of. He realized that his grandmother's values and his grandmother's religion did not accept homosexuality. And he did quote to me something from the Bible that talks about homosexuality as being, unnatural and something to be banished. He didn't agree with that, and he had trouble with that, reconciling that with, how he felt about his grandmother. After deciding that he wasn't going to be saved by religion, he wholeheartedly embraced the homosexual culture. He kept it hidden from his grandmother, but would take the bus and hang out in the gay area of town.
He was not just controlling urges to have homosexual contact with other people. For him, his sexuality was not only homosexual expression, but it also was an interest in necrophilia and a profound interest in control of other people. So that from him, he was controlling the whole package, and that release of any one of those things meant the whole thing came out.
In November 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer took a man back to a rented room in Milwaukee. He woke up to find he had beaten the man to death. 9 years
Woke up
after
to
his
find
homicide,
that?
he had killed again.
That started everything again. I was just interested in laying with people for the night up to that point. Something broke through, and I started the long slide down. It was an incessant, never-ending desire to have someone at whatever cost, someone good-looking, and it just filled my thoughts all day long.
By the spring of 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer had moved out of his grandmother's house and was living by himself in an apartment in downtown Milwaukee. Every day he caught a bus to the local chocolate factory, where he worked as a shop floor worker. Lionel remained in touch with his son. They met up in the fall in Milwaukee at the grandmother's house. But by that time, Jeffrey Dahmer had killed 5 people, 3 of them in that house.
In Thanksgiving of 1990, we made our usual trip to Milwaukee to visit my mother. I took along a camcorder just to preserve us on camera. I took pictures of my mother and Jeff. So what have you been doing? Like working and working and working and working?
Working next week, starting Monday. I go back to work Sunday nights.
Oh, boy.
And
So you go back to work this Sunday night?
yeah.
It looks good though. It looks nice and trim.
Oh, that's good to hear.
You look like you're working out,
No.
aren't you?
Oh, I haven't worked.
Looking at Jeff, he looks entirely normal, clean cut, very nicely dressed, responds very sociably. You still keep up your membership there, though. There's nothing to indicate, really, that he had recently killed people.
No, I've been surviving on McDonald's food for, since I moved down here.
I really could not really see how I or anyone could think that he had been involved with murder or even something less than that. There's just no indication. I don't think. I couldn't see anything. Could you, honestly? And of course, you woke up at what, 8 this morning? And then you cleaned up your apartment really nicely so you could show us what it looks like?
Yeah, I want you to come over if you feel like it. I haven't done any dusting or vacuuming or anything. I do that on Sundays. But as I was talking with Jeff and trying to get a feel for why he was killing people, some of the things that he brought up was, the first point was that all of the other people who he tried to have a close personal relationship with would eventually leave, and he didn't want them to leave. So by killing them, he ensured that they were no longer going to go anywhere. The other part was that ever since he was a small child, when he found out that he was gay, this was a part of his life that he knew was not acceptable to his mom or dad. He knew was not acceptable to his school or his religion, so he kept it very secret. And in a way, Jeff felt that his secret life, his gay life, gave him power in a way that it was something that nobody else that knew him knew about. It was his own little world that he had a certain amount of control over, and he enjoyed that.
Do you know who the other person is there? That beautiful blonde sitting on the couch? Yawning? That's right.
And who is this? Jeff. That's Cousin Jeff.
Yes. Looks like a bunch of satisfied people sitting around here. Yes.
I think you can't deny the fact that he was pursuing pleasures when he was doing this. But to a large extent, Jeff had nothing else going in his life. The relationships with people meant nothing to him. He had no capacity to have contacts with other people such that he would find some reward or pleasure or comfort in those relationships. So that the variety of spheres of most people's lives wasn't what he experienced. This is all that he had.
The need for human
Yeah,
contact
Jesus.
that contributed to him killing went beyond the dismembering and saving of body parts. It led to him eating them.
The reason why he killed people was to keep them with him. And now, by eating the body, not only was he keeping them with him, but he was actually eating them and making this person part of him. So they were with him forever. They were one with Jeff. Although it sounds bizarre and incredible, at the time that he told me this story, I must admit it made perfect sense to me. I don't know if that means that I'm crazy too, but although I didn't agree with any of it, I mean, it seemed like a logical succession to what he did.
Jeffrey Dahmer's ultimate plan was to build a shrine with the skulls and bones of those he had killed.
Jeff described a shrine that he had envisioned making, and he had the component parts to it. It consisted of a recreated skeleton and skulls. And he envisioned it as a place where he could go and sit before. And it would be a time when he could get in touch with something larger than himself, that he could go and feel comfortable, that it would give his life some meaning. So that in my assessment, there is an aspect of this that is a quest for spirituality.
Thinking about what Jeff has done in these bizarre thoughts, actions, the killings, I reconcile that in my mind with loving him and continuing to think of him as my son, a loving son, and having love toward him by viewing that side of him as something which he absolutely allowed to be out of control, or was in fact controlling him.
Please, come on. Really, seriously. Everybody up.
The pace of his killing accelerated. In the summer of 1991, in just 3 weeks, he murdered another 4 men. He had by now killed 17 people.
It's very clear at the end that he was utterly, absolutely out of control with all of this. The bodies truly were piling up, literally were piling up.
They got mad.
Whoops.
He, at one point, had one in the bathtub and one hanging from the shower, and he slept with one in the bed next to him for a while simply because he didn't have time to dispose of it. You know, it really points to somebody not who was in control of that, but who, in a sense, was being controlled by that.
Jeffrey Dahmer was finally discovered at his apartment, surrounded by the evidence. He was arrested and charged with murder.
At the first meeting with Jeff after he was arrested, I held him close and I cried for about a minute, and Jeff did not show any emotion at all. And I didn't really realize it at the time. I talked with him about it afterwards, but I didn't really realize it that he wasn't showing any emotion at the time because I was shaking so much. I thought he was shaking too.
In January 1992, the trial opened in Milwaukee.
It was frightening. It was traumatic to have the victims' families to our left, and there were activist groups to our right, and people stared at us. In fact, some sweet old lady came and sat down beside me, and someone came over and whispered in her ear who we were and made her move. It was a do and a don't situation. We didn't want to be there, but we had to be there.
While the details of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes became widely known, he himself had not been seen publicly since his arrest. Among those waiting in court for his first appearance was the author Brian Masters.
There was an enormous feeling of hatred, resentment, anger, as if they would have torn him limb from limb if they could have done. Because he'd not only bereaved them, but he had removed from them the object of their grief. They had no bodies to grieve over.
All right, please.
What this man had done, he had the ultimately ridiculous notion of taking somebody's will away by drilling a hole in the head of a live man who'd had too much to drink and was drugged, and pouring acid into the hole in the head in order to deprive him of that part of his brain which would wish to have a will of its own to leave, and he hoped that he would keep people in this way. These are the things this man had done, and what we saw was somebody who looked like a tennis player, somebody who looked fairly studious, very quiet, unsmiling, no sense of life to him. He seemed to be a whole jigsaw puzzle with the central point missing and irrecoverable.
Jeffrey Dahmer's guilt or innocence depended on his state of mind at the time of his crimes. The defense argued that because he was a necrophiliac, he was not able to control his actions. The prosecution rejected this.
What this defendant did, he decided, this man that sits in this courtroom now, for his sexual satisfaction, killed Stephen Hicks.
I thought the rhetoric at the trial took a very bizarre turn in that it was presented to the jury as though killing and eating and masturbating over dead bodies and having sex in the viscera of the bodies was just another sexual choice that Jeff had made. And it was clear to me, reading his very horrifying confession to the police, that it was anything but that. That the killings got more desperate for him, not calculating.
If you just look at the totality of what Jeff Dahmer did, obviously you got to say he's freaking nuts. I mean, only a nut would do this. Only a crazy person would do what he did. But if you look at the whole story, the whole scenario of Jeff Dahmer, from his earliest sexual awakenings and dabbling and cutting up of roadkill animals that he found, through his experiences with which I would call an accidental death in Bath, although he would have had to pay some consequence for it, to his second death, which kind of triggered the whole thing again here in Milwaukee. It's very logical to me how he got into this situation. When you would talk to Jeff Dahmer, you definitely would not get the idea that you were talking to a nut.
In special verdict question number 1. At the time the crime was committed in count 2 of the information, did the defendant, Jeffrey L. Dahmer, have a mental disease? Answer, no. Question number 2 need not be answered.
On each count of murder, the jury rejected the claim that Jeffrey Dahmer had a mental disease and declared him legally sane. While Dr. Smale agreed with the verdict, he admits that the language of the law fails to truly describe Jeffrey Dahmer.
You all agree that I have accurately...
It seemed to me like that he had seen madness, in a layman's sense, that he had seen madness. I don't know how to say that professionally, but that he had been someplace and had partially come back, but had been someplace that others wouldn't go, couldn't go, but haven't been.
It now becomes the duty of the court to impose sentence in this case. The important point is that the sentence is structured in such a way that this defendant will never again see freedom.
One of the implications for the jury's verdict here was...
Oh, shit. That's what I'm talking about.
Was responsible for what he had done, but that Jeff had done it. The implication of that is that he remains one of us, that he is still within the bounds of humanity. And that, I think, is for me, more uncomfortable than the idea that he was insane and not responsible for what he did.
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I am so sorry for that, and sorry for everyone else that I have hurt. I have hurt my mother and father and stepmother. I love them all so very much. I hope that they will find the same peace I am looking for.
After the trial, Teresa Smith, a sister of one of the victims, decided she wanted to speak with Lionel and Shari. Shari had made the first tentative move in the courtroom. 3 years later, their conversations have developed into a friendship.
You come very good.
There you go.
Thank you.
Very pretty. Where's Lionel?
Oh, he's in Lord.
I have parents, and I put myself in their shoes. If that was my parents, they would be going through a lot, and the guilt is just overwhelming, and you could see them and feel that when you talk to them.
How you doing? Yeah.
Good to see you.
It's good to see you.
She
too.
came bearing gifts.
No kidding. What did you bring me?
Well, I
It's in my hand.
I don't hold them responsible for what Jeff did ever. He was grown when he did this. I talk about his life because I wanted to see what kind of upbringing he came from.
In trying to come to terms with Eddie's death, Teresa felt she had to meet the man who had killed her brother.
I wanted to know Eddie's last words because I wanted to know what mood my brother was in before he took his life. Well, he said he was sorry when I first walked in there. That's the first thing he basically said to me, and he was sorry for killing him. And it was just pure selfishness on his part. And if he could do it all over, he wouldn't have did none of that. But he couldn't help himself. So
I'm really glad to see you guys.
We are too. We're glad you're back
This
down
summer?
here.
She is unlike any other person I know because I would have a very hard time forgiving anyone associated with someone who had done what Jeff did to my loved ones.
I wish everything could be this peaceful.
I know.
Friends
It'd
get
be nice,
along like
wouldn't it?
this here.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be nice to have your own private little island somewhere to escape?
Yes.
Just forget it all.
You just understood that you had to move on and you had to understand. Otherwise, you would just stay in the past, and I couldn't deal with that because just thinking about that hurt it even more. It's been 3 years and it still hurts, but it doesn't hurt as much as I didn't before I knew them.
How's your family doing?
They're doing well, as well to be expected and stuff,
Good.
And yours?
Just getting by, right. About the same.
Yeah. I think he did what he could. You can always look back and say, you should have did this, and you should have did that, and you should have been aware of this. But you can't. It's like I said, it's easier to look back and blame. It's harder to just go ahead and say, well, this is what we'll take it from there.
A decision Jeffrey Dahmer has recently made has helped Lionel to look forwards. His son has chosen to be baptized.
All my life, I've tried to do practical things for Jeff to help him out when he's gotten into trouble, and maybe I wasn't just equipped to do that. But whatever the reason, his recent baptism into Christ and his newfound faith is a comfort to me because I feel like I've had some part in doing that, and it's very important to me. Perhaps the victims' families will come to believe that he does deserve the end reward.
I can't forgive him right now, but being the way I grew up and being a Christian, you're supposed to. You never forget. But one of these days, I might be able to do that and just let it go.
Well, my opinion as a police officer is that it's easy to get religion when you're in jail. I mean, there's no place else to go. But I also do believe, because I have a faith, that if he wants to live with himself, and this is a point that I tried to drive home to him when I was trying to get him to tell me about the homicides, was that he had to admit to God what he did, ask for forgiveness, make some amends, and that's the only way he'd be able to live with himself. From my conversations with Jeff, I would say that he is genuinely reaching out and trying to embrace some religious aspects of life in order to make his life more bearable.
He's there for the rest of his life. That is his home. That is where he's going to die. And to make amends with God is the right thing to do. And that's the only one who's going to forgive him for his sins. We have no right to say, oh, you can't be baptized. You know, who are we?
When I found out what Jeff had done, I could have just walked away and forgotten about any type of affiliation or duty. The reason I stayed with Jeff is that I identify so closely in his shyness, his feelings of ineptness and inferiority. There's a very deep love there to try to do something to show the world what he really was like as a youth.
In looking at what he had done as an adult, one would expect to find horrible secrets coming out of his childhood, perhaps abuse of various kinds. There simply was never any evidence to support those notions. He had an imperfect childhood. Many people do, and not anybody else comes to an adult life and winds up killing people as Jeff has done. So while there may be contributing factors in his childhood, they certainly don't provide an answer as to why Jeff did what he did do.
People want us to feel ashamed, and I think that's sad. I think that's incredibly sad that they want us to bear the shame for his crimes. We have nothing to be ashamed of. We're guilty of bearing the same last name. My husband gave him creation. It was part of his creation, but we have no reason to be ashamed. And I'm puzzled sometimes when people look at us as though we have not eaten enough dirt or paid a dear enough price, because I dare any of them to walk in our shoes.
It's amazing to me in 31 years, 31 short years, how I could create such hell for myself and everyone around me, because I did it. It's my doing, my little horrid creation. You know, I mean, people can say, well, it was family pressures or it was mental disease, but the fact is that I'm the one that did it. Very self-destructive life.
Five of the most prolific serial killers in American history were all operating at the same time.
John Wayne Gacy's
Ted Bundy is still alive.
BTK.
Jeffrey Dahmer.
The Green River Killer.
This was the golden age of serial killing.
For years, the Green River Task Force has chased the ghost of a killer too diabolically clever to catch.
There were a number of detectives who truly believed Gary Ridgway was the Green River Killer. But certainly we did not have the evidence to move forward with prosecution.
Serial killer Theodore Bundy is executed after nearly a decade on death row. Bundy was convicted of 3 brutal murders and was linked to dozens more.
I was glad when he was gone, but unfortunately, killing a serial killer doesn't stop them from being a serial killer. They did their damage.
It took the jury less than 2 hours to find John Wayne Gacy guilty of murdering 33 young men.
When he was sentenced to death, he didn't even blink. He didn't bat an eye, nothing. Now, that's a true sociopath. I mean, the guy was scary.
Serial killers, they're very arrogant and they think they're unstoppable. And that's what happened with Dahmer.
This kid had had a small hole drilled in his head and acid poured in, so he couldn't communicate with law enforcement.
They let Conorak go back into Jeffrey's apartment, and within an hour, he killed him.
Back in 1974, we couldn't even spell DNA, but at Josephine's feet, there was a pool. 31 years later, a genetic profile would be drawn from one of those preserved pieces of evidence.
BTK goes through this period where he does not kill for years.
And then in 1985, he kills his neighbor, Maureen Hedge. Well, they never dreamed this was BTK because BTK had disappeared.
Dennis Rader was a church-going, well-respected member of the community that hid this incredibly dark side. Now, there was a long period of time when Dennis wasn't active physically in killing. He was active mentally. He fantasizes about it. You can only fantasize so long before you cross that line. Once you've crossed that line, that is not a line you can come back from.
After he kills his neighbor, Maureen Hedge, and then Vicky Wegerly, BTK disappears again. He waits 5 more years until 1991 to kill again. And this is Dolores Davis.
My mom, she had gone out to eat, came back, and I know Mom's habit, she'd stay up till about 10 or so, and then she'd lock everything down, and she'd go to bed.
Rather than trying to break quietly into Dolores Davis's home, he just throws a cement block through her sliding glass door.
She came out of the bedroom and thought the car had hit her house, and I told her that I was on the run. After I tied her up, went through some things in the room there, and then strangled her.
I got a call from my sister that next day saying that her house had been broken into and she was gone.
Dolores starts off as a missing person, but it's clear from her residence that something bad had happened.
The one thing that really stuck out to me, there was a half-eaten bowl of cereal on her countertop. I said, something's wrong about that. She never went to bed with a dirty kitchen, period. He thinks he's a comedian, so he ate a bowl of cereal to let everybody know that he was a serial killer. Isn't he a charming fellow?
Dolores D. Davis was abducted from her home. Her body was found 13 days later under a bridge in northern Sedgwick County. Davis had been strangled. Her feet, hands, and knees were bound with pantyhose.
They told us that they had found a white female. He said, quote, "We're 99% sure it's your mother." And that's troubling because if she wasn't recognizable, then that's hard to swallow. I came unglued. I just completely lost it.
His MO was bind, torture, kill, leave the body in the house. But Dolores Davis's body was found in a ditch. It just didn't fit.
From a police perspective, they're still dealing with homicides on a case-by-case basis. Something like a change in MO could really trigger the idea that this is not the same killer, that this is a one-off. So the police are not looking at BTK. He is not a suspect. In 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer is also flying under the radar of police.
Jeffrey Dahmer's victim selection, young gay men, racial minority, allowed him to evade law enforcement for a longer period of time. Because he knew, on some level, that this was a disenfranchised element of society that would go unnoticed were they to disappear.
All I would have had to do was
just stop for several months at a time and space it out. But it didn't happen that way. I just was driven to do it more frequently and more frequently. Couldn't control it anymore.
Dahmer met Tracy Edwards outside the Grand Avenue Mall, and then they went to his apartment.
Dahmer said, "Why don't you come back to my place and I'll pay you some money to take some pictures of you and we can watch some movies."
And I thought about it and said, yeah, he's pretty cool. I guess it's all right to go have a beer because I thought he was an average guy. So he seemed normal to me, you know.
Dahmer offers Tracy a drink of rum and coke because Dahmer was out of the sleeping pills.
I had my head turned like this looking at the fish tank, you know. Before I know it, he threw a handcuff on me.
Tracy said, okay, there must be something wrong with this guy. I'm just going to appease him and talk to him for a minute, especially when Dahmer pulled out this huge hunting knife. And Dahmer puts on The Exorcist 3, and they're watching it, and Dahmer's humming and rocking back and forth, almost going into a trance. And saying things to Tracy Edwards like, oh, you wouldn't believe what I've done, and now I'm going to do to you, and I want to eat your heart. He actually put his head up against Tracy Edwards' chest just to listen to his heartbeat because he wanted to hear it before he murdered him.
Like I knew that it was a life and death situation then, right? Yeah, it was me against him.
Eventually, Tracy gets loose, punches him, and he gets out of the apartment half naked wearing this one handcuff.
Mr. Edwards is able to run onto the street and flag down a squad. And those two officers first just tried to use their key that they had for their police handcuffs. That key didn't work. And so they went back to the apartment thinking that they're just going to get the key from Dahmer and take those handcuffs off, and that's going to be the end of it.
I'm in my house, and then I open up my door, and I'm looking out here, and I'm seeing the guy was at his door dangling this handcuff thing like this, and there's an officer standing there. And I hear people coming in the apartment. I hear a little bit of commotion over at his house.
One of the police officers goes in the bedroom and they see a drawer that's open.
They had no idea what they would find there. Didn't know there was a skull in the refrigerator. It was a death nest.
Milwaukee police were led to an apartment in this building after they were flagged down by a handcuffed man who claimed he had been attacked.
The police went up and they were talking to Dahmer. Well, one of the officers went in the bedroom and saw the photos in the drawer, and that started everything.
In this drawer are dozens of Polaroids of young men dismembered, murdered, in a bathtub, their skin stripped off, just awful pictures. So the cops arrest Dahmer, who starts to fight with them.
And then I heard an awful, horrible scream. It sounded like an animal's growl, like a bear or something like that. It was Jeff. He screamed like that because he did not want them to look in the refrigerator and to see the head.
Then they open the refrigerator, there's a fully embellished skull of one of his earlier victims. And he's telling them right away what's happening. Short order, he's giving a full confession.
They said, where's the key for the handcuffs? He said, I don't have it. I was going to cut his hands off.
That night after he got arrested, they started bringing out boxes and big soup kettles. And I'm going, well, what's in there and what's in there? They said, please, ma'am, don't look in there. And they said, those are body parts in those pots. And in those boxes are skulls. It was horrible. It was absolutely horrible.
After Dahmer is apprehended, the news of what happened with the Conorak incident comes forward.
The neighbors called police when this 14-year-old, a brother of the boy Dahmer molested, was seen running naked and bleeding from Dahmer's apartment. The police returned the boy to Dahmer after he said they were lovers.
He got away with it by telling the officers, "This is my lover."
Was anything done about the situation?
No, there's an intoxicated boyfriend of another boyfriend.
Are you sure?
Yep.
Yep. I do think there was some shoddy workmanship on the police part that night. They supposedly didn't even check Dahmer's ID to check if he had any criminal history.
That would be another person, or if that boy be white, could it be different?
Outrage over Dahmer has shifted to police. There are charges of racism, a belief that many of the killings could have been stopped.
Because it was in the inner city, ghetto, neighborhood, poor, black people. They just mistreated all of us down there. They should be held responsible.
You didn't say nothing about this white boy over here killing us over here. Somebody that's going to investigate the police department.
Relationships between law enforcement and marginalized communities were very tense. Not much has changed, and I think that's evident considering, the summer of unrest we had in 2020. We still have a long way to go with police relationships and communities of color.
Jeffrey Dahmer today changed his plea from not guilty to guilty but insane.
And you're doing this of your own free will? Yes, I'm doing this voluntarily.
He never denied that he killed. He pled guilty, gave full confession, and pled guilty. So the focus was insanity or not.
The trial will be to determine Dahmer's state of mind when the murders occurred.
The defense was that Dahmer lost control of himself. This necrophilia, the desire for sex with dead bodies, the desire for sex with unconscious bodies, put him out of control. He couldn't control himself. He ought not be held accountable. That was the defense.
So you have some of these serial killers who are engaging with the victims after they die. Guys like Bundy and Gacy and even Ridgway leaving and then coming back a day or two later to then engage with the victim. That means that you have total possession, total control. They're yours. Guys like Jeffrey Dahmer are actually consuming parts of their victims. So why would you do that? Because you can possess them forever if you eat them. So that's really the ultimate possession.
Besides the just mere curiosity of what it would be like, it made them feel part of me, and it gave me a sexual satisfaction to do that.
I was the district attorney for 38 years, and so I've had a lot of experience. So the necrophilia wasn't that shocking. Cannibalism, I tell you, I had not been exposed to very often.
Would you state your name, spelling your last name? Dennis Murphy, M-U-R-P-H-Y.
I interviewed Dahmer for 66 to 68 hours, which resulted in a 168-page confession. And the first thing he told me is, "You should kill me for what I did."
He then purchased a meat tenderizer and used it on the bicep. He stated he would put salt, pepper, and A1 steak sauce on it. He stated that it tasted like beef or a filet mignon.
Today at the Jeffrey Dahmer insanity trial, a detective testified on how Dahmer told him he would eat some of his victims.
The reason that he consumed the bicep because it was big and he wanted to try it.
During the interrogation with Dahmer, once I got him to feel more comfortable with me, like a buddy, he just kept giving us information. We asked him about his friends, and he said they never had any. In fact, we checked his phone records. He never made a personal call in 5 years.
He stated that he kept the victim's skull, which he boiled to remove all the skin. And he kept the scalp with the small ponytail because he liked it.
I asked him why he did this. Several times he told us for his own selfish desire for self-gratification.
Nobody can deny Jeffrey Dahmer is a sick person. Not psychotic. And he's not legally insane.
Insanity is a legal definition. It isn't a medical definition. The insanity defense is a very difficult defense to employ. It's rare that it's used, and it's even more rare that it's successful.
Over the weekend, a jury ruled that Dahmer was sane when he murdered and dismembered 15 young men.
Dahmer got
I'm
a
about to
life
become military
sentence
now.
for each of his victims. 957 years without the chance of parole.
The sentence is structured in
Ouch.
such a way that this defendant will never again see freedom.
When Gacy was executed, there were hundreds of people from all over.
My mother said she wanted to be the one to push the button, but she passed away before that. And I do remember her saying, "You better be there." I said, "I will be there." He deserved to die.
There was no sympathy anywhere, as far as I know, in the world for Gacy.
Here we are entering the 21st century, and Bundy and Gacy have been executed. Dahmer was murdered in prison. And so all we have left are Rader and Ridgway. By 2001,
Bruh.
Gary Ridgway is still married, still has a stable job, still living in the community, and he's murdered 49 women and evaded law enforcement for 19 years.
But the investigators were pretty smart, because what they did do was they took a saliva
Ouch.
sample from Gary in 1987. They were hoping the DNA technology would advance to a point when they would be able to analyze it.
In 2001, there was a grant for DNA testing at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. They asked us for those cases that are really big cases that you want us to look at DNA evidence.
The Green River Task Force had DNA for 4 of the victims, but they knew there were a lot more.
So it essentially took 14 years for our DNA technology to get to the point where we could then analyze the sample that Ridgway had provided to the early samples from his early prostitute homicides.
The sheriff was in his office when his lead detective gave him the amazing news.
The DNA came back positive from 4 victims matching to Gary Ridgway and from nobody else, unless he had an identical twin. And so that was really the big break in the case.
You know, we had 40,000 suspects. Now we got the guy. See?
It's pretty amazing. You know, when the hit came out, it was like, whoa, this tells you what science can do. Even though there were only 4 cases that could be charged at that time, you know, we knew what we were dealing with. Upwards of 50 women.
Alright.
Gary got
I'm gonna end the stream here for now.
normally did. And then the sheriff's office served search warrants at multiple
I
locations.
may be back later.
Take him into
I may
custody
not.
at Kenworth Truck as he's walking out after work.
Either way, thank you all for watching. Appreciate it.
Connected to the Green River
Deuce.
murder case believe it may finally be solved with the arrest of Gary Ridgway.